Fatal upbringing, age difference, favoritism towards exclusive pets, dual cleanliness, slow heat, a cute and soft-looking little white rabbit with a black belly versus a paranoid little uncle with a cold exterior and hot interior. That year, due to a tragedy, Ye Zhirang became an orphan girl residing in the Pei family and began living with his uncle Pei Jinghuai. Pei Jinghuai is serious and aloof, placing great importance on his own life order, and has a strong sense of boundaries when interacting with others. At first, Ye Zhirang was seen by him as a small troublemaker who had no blood relationship and loved to cry. In order not to watch her cry, he tried his best to be patient with her. After spending a long time together, when he mentioned Ye Zhirang, he opened his mouth and said, "My child." The most spoken words are, "Just don't cry, give whatever you want." If he wants the moon, he can also find a ladder and pick 2 stars to coax her. He indulged her, doted on her, but also taught her many principles of social conduct. He made her believe that as long as he was there, she wouldn't be lonely or afraid. He treated her like a father and a brother, treated her as a good teacher and friend, and took good care of this delicate flower. But who knew that he held the large rose carefully and secretly fell in love with him? Like Pei Jinghuai, Ye Zhirang kept it hidden until the eve of college. She confessed while drunk, but he said she was crazy. Ye Zhirang did not give up and pursued for 2 years, but Pei Jinghuai remained unmoved. She was tired, broke the jar, and stopped chasing. But later on, when she brought her fake boyfriend to him and said she wanted to get married, have a family, and be filial to him together, someone who had always been proud and self-confident had red eyes, trapping her in her arms and saying, "Let go, don't act recklessly." Ye Zhirang laughed and said, "It's been so long since we last saw each other, has uncle gone crazy too?" Chapter 1. Pei Family. You are listening at Novel Full.Audio. It is reported that at 2:58 a.m. on September 30th, a deliberate arson case occurred in Ye Zhirang community, Dongyang district, Sucheng, resulting in 2 deaths. Currently, the suspect Ye has been arrested. Ye Zhirang wiped away his tears and turned off his phone, which was silently playing news. Half a month ago, it happened to be Mid-Autumn Festival. The day before noon, her mother Tang Yi and stepfather Pei Jinghuai sent her back to her grandmother's house half a city away. The family sat together and had a reunion dinner. At night, my grandmother wanted Tang Yi and his wife to stay overnight, but Tang Yi refused. She said she would go back to Pei's old house with Pei Jinghuai tomorrow to see the old man. Grandmother didn't stay any longer, but who would have thought that something would happen as soon as they left? On the night of Mid-Autumn Festival, Tang Fun and Pei Jinghuai spent the Mid-Autumn Festival in Pei's old house and returned to Villa 23, Ye Zhirang community, Dongyang district. At around 12 o'clock in the morning, Tang Fun's ex-husband Ye Han, who had been chased by creditors due to gambling debts, knocked on the door of the Pei family. After demanding money without success, Ye Han and Pei Jinghuai had a dispute and attacked him from behind while he didn't have a spare vase. Tang Fun wanted to report to the police, but was stabbed several times in the abdomen by Ye Han with a fruit knife. Perhaps she had even watched Ye Han repair the fallen Pei Jinghuai. After finishing all of this, Ye Han plundered some money from the Pei family. Out of frustration, he never stopped and set fire to a big fire. It wasn't until the neighbors saw the flames that they called the police. By the time the police and firefighters arrived, Tang Hui and Pei Jinghuai had lost their breath. After the incident, Ye Han was quickly locked down and arrested by the police. After learning about the sudden incident, Ye Zhirang's grandmother suffered a heart attack and was admitted to the hospital. She lay in bed, regretting that she shouldn't have let Tang Yi and Pei Jinghuai leave that night. She couldn't help but wonder how Tang Yi and Pei Jinghuai could rest assured that when there were only 2 of them at home, they agreed to let Ye Han, the beast, come knocking on the door this morning. Ye Zhirang's aunt and her family who had settled in Jiangqing also rushed back upon hearing the news. Aunt hugged Ye Zhirang and cried, while uncle was worried about her future. At this time, there were still many media reporters outside the ward who wanted to interview the families of the victims. Ye Zhirang was their ideal interviewee. After all, the tragic scene of her biological father killing her biological mother and stepfather for wealth and catching horses was excellent news material. Through a door, Ye Zhirang sat by her grandmother's hospital bed, listening to her aunt and uncle discuss her future and whether to stay or not. After this incident, my aunt had the idea of taking my grandmother to Jiangqing for retirement. But Ye Zhirang knew that they couldn't take her with them because her aunt's family was not very affluent either. There were also two cousins at home, one who had just entered freshman year and the other who was in junior year of high school this year. Both were times when money needed to be used, and they couldn't afford to have her who had just entered freshman year. As for the Ye family, she never even thought about going back. Grandparents value sons over daughters and never treated her well. Aunt and uncle remained silent until the end of their discussion. Ye Zhirang lowered her head, clutching her phone, silently calculating in her heart whether her mother's savings were enough for her to spend 3 years in high school. Will the teacher agree to her sudden accommodation application when she goes to school after the vacation ends? What kind of eyes and words would classmates who have read the news use to discuss her? Everything is unknown. For a long time, my uncle's phone rang. He got up and went out to answer the phone. After more than 10 minutes, he came back with a worried expression on his face. Tomorrow noon, the Pei family invited us to come over and talk about the aftermath of Qingji and Tanghui. Let's go together, too, he said. Auntie helped her sleeping grandmother tuck in the corner of her blanket and lowered her voice. This is adults' business. Why should we go over and do it? Ye Zhirang glanced at his uncle and lowered his head. My uncle habitually took out a cigarette box from his pocket, poured out a cigarette, and realized that smoking was not allowed here. He pinned the cigarette to his ear and said, "Let me at least call you Dad, who has been quiet for a year, and Grandpa, who has been the father of the Pei family for a year. The Pei family has a big business, so we need to show her some respect. If they give you a little, it will be enough for me to pass high school." Auntie said, "But Qingjing is because of that beast Ye Han." Halfway through the conversation, Aunt noticed that Ye Zhirang was present, so she quickly changed the tone and lowered her voice a bit. Qingji and Tangfun have not even obtained a marriage certificate. The Pei family is not doing charity, so there is no reason to make concessions. Uncle had just relieved a bit of his worries and put them back on his face. He sighed and said, "Let's go first. We'll talk about it when we go." The next afternoon, after taking care of my grandmother and finishing lunch, my aunt and uncle took Ye Zhirang to the Pei family's old house. This is Ye Zhirang's second time coming here. The last time was during the Chinese New Year, when he came with his mother to pay respects. In her impression, although Grandpa Pei of the Pei family is not in good health and has a low mental state, he is very kind and she likes this old man very much. Under the guidance of the butler, Ye Zhirang followed his aunt and uncle into the reception hall of the Pei family. The atmosphere in the reception hall was very dull, and Mr. Pei sitting in the main seat looked much older than before. At the bottom sat a young man with a mixed-race appearance, deep and sharp features. He was wearing a straight black suit with overlapping legs, and a cane with a black tip wrapped around a silver snake was placed beside him. The eyes of the silver snake were adorned with 2 bright rubies, and the overall style matched his temperament, both of which were reserved for strangers. Ye Zhirang guessed that he should be the uncle Pei Jinghuai, who has been living abroad and is often mentioned by his stepfather. Mr. Pei has 2 wives and 3 sons in total. The eldest son, Pei Qingji, is in charge of several branches under the Pei group. The second son, Pei Yun, settled abroad with his family 7 or 8 years ago because he was not liked by Mr. Pei, and rarely returned to China. The elder son born to Mr. Pei and his second French wife, Pei Jinghuai, is truly highly expected in the Pei family. He is only 9 years older than Ye Zhirang and lost his mother at a young age. At the age of 16, he had a car accident and had some ailments in his legs, so he is said to have a somewhat eccentric personality. Ye Zhirang sat directly opposite Pei Jinghuai next to his aunt. Out of curiosity, Ye Zhirang couldn't help but take a few more glances at him, but accidentally met his gaze. In just a moment, Ye Zhirang quickly lowered his head. Mr. Pei let out a tired sigh and said to the butler, "You go take Zhirang to eat something. There's no need to involve the children in what the adults want to talk about." The butler responded, and Ye Zhirang looked at her aunt and uncle, who nodded at her and said, "Let's go. Miss Ye, this way, please." In the restaurant, Ye Zhirang looked at the fruit juice and dim sum brought by the housekeeper in front of her and said thank you in a low voice. After the butler left, the surroundings became completely quiet. She picked up her glass and took a sip of juice, the sour and sweet orange flavor, which eased her nervousness, but the unease and anxiety in her heart remained unresolved. She does not believe that the outcome of adults' negotiations will be as her aunt and uncle wish. Even if Grandpa Pei is kind, there is no reason to pay for her education, let alone she is still Ye Han's daughter. Ye Zhirang put down her cup and sighed. She was enveloped in a deep sense of powerlessness. If she could grow up and have the ability to earn money to support herself, perhaps she wouldn't be so passive and helpless. Thinking this way, she only felt acid in her eyes, wanting to cry but not daring to cry, afraid of being disliked by adults. She raised her hand and rubbed her eyes. Coincidentally, Pei Jinghuai walked into the restaurant. He didn't walk fast, but he was very steady. If it weren't for holding a cane, it wouldn't have been possible to tell that his leg had an old illness. He opened the refrigerator and took a bottle of water, twisted it open and took a sip. Ye Zhirang looked at him and timidly shrank back. Pei Jinghuai pulled out his chair and sat opposite her, without saying a word. He took out his phone and frowned slightly, unsure of what he was looking at. Ye Zhirang looked out nervously and helplessly, hoping that her elders could quickly end the discussion and ask her to go and make the final verdict. Chapter 2. Reception. You are listening at Novel Full.Audio. How old are you this year? Pei Jinghuai spoke at first, but Ye Zhirang didn't react and was momentarily stunned. Uncle, are you asking me? I am 16 and a freshman in high school, studying at Suching Experimental High School. She said as she spoke, her voice became quieter and she didn't dare to look at Pei Jinghuai, so she lowered her head. What are your plans in the future? Pei Jinghuai took a sip of water and continued to ask. I don't know. Maybe it's just taking the college entrance examination, then going to school. Finding a job that can support oneself is good. Do you usually talk a lot? Before Ye Zhirang could answer, the butler walked in and respectfully said to Pei Jinghuai, "Third young master, why are you here? The car is already prepared, are you going out now?" Pei Jinghuai tightened the bottle cap, stood up, and picked up his cane. Wipe away your tears, the old man called you. Ye Zhirang obediently wiped the corners of his eyes, and as he looked up, he met Pei Jinghuai's emotionless gaze. I don't know why, Pei Jinghuai is very good looking, her voice is also very pleasant to listen to, and her attitude is also normal toward strangers. Even after answering a few questions from him, her sadness and nervousness were slightly relieved, but there is no reason why she is afraid of him. Ye Zhirang watched as Pei Jinghuai slowly walked away, rubbed her eyes, and only then did she get up and walk towards the reception hall when the clicking sound of her cane gradually disappeared from Pei's old house. As soon as she entered, she saw her aunt crying. Mr. Pei waved to her and she went over. She heard Mr. Pei ask, "Zhirang, good child, would you like to stay by Grandpa's side?" Ye Zhirang looked at his uncle in confusion. His uncle lowered his head, seeming to struggle for a while, and dared not look at her. Jean, you are a big child now. You should know that your grandmother's health is getting worse and worse every year. Your aunt and I are also working in Jiangqing and cannot come back, so we plan to take your grandmother away this time. As for you. He paused and said, you just started your first year of high school and can't leave. Your high school studies are also tight, and if you go to day school, you can't do without adults to take care of you. Your aunt and uncle really have limited abilities and can't afford your life. The Pei family is trustworthy, and you stayed here for your own good. At the end of the day, it's just a matter of money. In fact, this result is similar to Ye Zhirang's prediction. The only difference is that the Pei family is actually willing to take her, and she was in a state of panic and confusion, her hands and feet tingling slightly. After a long silence, she raised her hand and wiped away her tears, then became a good child again and nodded. Although my aunt and uncle still have a guilty expression on their face, they are clearly relieved. Returning to the hospital, my aunt and grandmother politely talked about this matter, which made my grandmother furious. Ye Zhirang stood against the wall, like a child who had done something wrong, listening to her grandmother's tearful outburst at her aunt and uncle. She said, "We want to make sure it's not a child that nobody wants. My old lady is still alive, so there's no need for her to be placed under someone else's protection." Ye Zhi looked at his grandmother with tearful eyes, hoping to rely on her for a living. If he could be with her, it would be better to live in the unfamiliar Pei family. But there is also some contradiction in her heart. Grandmother has been working hard all her life, and her health has never been good. She has been hit so hard again this time. She should go to Jiangqing to take care of her aunt and uncle, instead of continuing to live a difficult life with her as a drag-on. Grandma's face was pale and her lips turned purple. She pressed her heart and pulled out the oxygen tube under her nose, pointing at her aunt and uncle. Her voice trembled with anger and she said, "You go tell the Pei family and thank them for their kindness." "Let's not go to the Pei family." Auntie said anxiously, "I made myself agree, and Mom, you must also consider her future. The Pei family has power and influence, and we see that Mr. Pei really likes her as a younger generation. If she goes to the Pei family, she will definitely be better than following us. Besides, at least she won't be short of money." Ye Zhi's eyes dimmed as she knew that everything could not be separated from a single word of money. In fact, upon closer examination, her aunt was right. Grandmother was not in good health, with a monthly retirement salary of 3,000 yuan and the need to buy medicine. Tang Hui's savings were not much, and if she followed her grandmother, she would be a burden. "I don't care, let's not go to Pei's house." "Grandma, I'm willing to go to Pei's house." As soon as she spoke, her grandmother was stunned and stopped arguing with her aunt. Her voice trembled and she was full of disappointment and confusion. "Let's go, do you know what you're talking about? The feeling of being under someone else's influence is not easy, let alone you have no relationship with the Pei family. They are willing to do charity, but no one can say how kind they are. If you go and get angry, what should you do?" Ye Zhirang forced out a smile and said, "I've been wronged, so I'll come back to find my grandmother. It's only been around for 3 years. When I go to college, I can work and earn money on my own. It's just 3 years, it's okay." Grandmother's tears streamed down her face, and she sobbed with grief and anger, panting heavily. Ignoring the needle still in her hand, she slapped the blanket to vent her anger, crying and sighing, "My poor child. Oh my goodness, why are you so inconspicuous?" The Pei family dealt with the problem very quickly. That night, they took action to disperse the media reporters outside the ward and even sent bodyguards to guard. There has been much less news online about the murders of Tang Yi and Pei Jinghuai, and all reports related to Ye Zhirang have disappeared. Immediately afterwards, the butler called to inform that in order not to delay Ye Zhirang's studies, someone would be sent tomorrow noon to pick her up at the Pei family. The next day at noon, just after lunchtime, the Pei family came to pick up Ye Zhirang's car and arrived downstairs at his grandmother's house. Because in the past year, Ye Zhirang and Tang Yi have been living in the imperial garden, so the luggage she left at her grandmother's house was only packed with a backpack. She sat awkwardly in the car holding her bag, feeling both uneasy and uneasy. Quickly, the car stopped in front of the Pei family's old house, and the butler helped her open the car door. Ye Zhirang quickly said thank you. She was arranged by the butler to stay in a guest room at the corner of the second floor of the old mansion. The room had a bed, a table, a small wardrobe, and a separate bathroom. This configuration condition can be said to be very good. After a brief look at the room, Ye Zhirang placed her bag on the table. She opened the wardrobe, took out a hanger, hung up the few clothes in her bag, and placed the family photo she had just taken with her mother and stepfather on the bedside table. After more than 10 minutes, the butler knocked on the door and the nanny brought in several shopping bags and a stack of new textbooks. Ye Zhirang opened those bags, which contained clothes that could be worn this season, as well as a brand new school uniform. At dinner, she met Mr. Pei and he asked if she was still used to living there. She asked the butler to give her another card, saying that if there was anything missing or needed, she would buy it herself. If there was not enough money, she would ask the butler for it. Every month's pocket money would be transferred to this card. Ye Zhirang was frightened and refused to accept it. Grandpa Pei smiled and said, "Poor raise a son and rich raise a daughter. When a girl grows up, she always needs to carry some money on her body. I don't have any grandchildren to accompany me, and during the Mid-Autumn Festival, only your stepfather and mother come back to see me. Your mother conveyed her greetings to me on your behalf. It's rare that you, as a child, have a heart, and my grandfather is also genuinely happy. It's good for us to be companions as a whole in the future. You can talk to me more when you have time, and I can also relieve my boredom." Ye Zhirang looked at the bank card in front of her and tears welled up in her eyes. She didn't expect that her polite greeting could turn the gears of fate and win the acceptance of the Pei family. She no longer declined, choked up and whispered, "Thank you, Grandpa. Good child, Grandpa and grandson, you don't need to be so polite." Mr. Pei took a sip of tea and said, "By the way, at the end of the month, your uncle will come back to stay for a few days. He is a cold-hearted child. If you don't like him, just avoid him and walk a bit." Ye Zhirang nodded obediently and said, "I know, Grandpa, rest assured." Chapter 3. Farewell. You are listening at Novel Full.Audio. At the end of October, under the leadership of Mr. Pei, Tang Fun and Pei Jinghuai were buried together in Guiyuan in the south of the city. Pei Jinghuai also returned to the Pei family. After finishing dinner in the evening, Ye Zhi asked him to go upstairs to his room to do his homework. As soon as he reached the corner of the stairs, he heard the clicking sound of his cane touching the ground from behind. As soon as she turned around, she met Pei Jinghuai's gaze. Out of a subconscious reaction, she almost immediately stood still and asked, "Hello, uncle." Pei Jinghuai was stunned for a moment, but quickly recovered as usual. With a nod in response, he calmly followed Ye Zhirang's gaze and went upstairs. Ye Zhirang curiously scrutinized his back, her gaze fixed on his lap. She felt that Pei Jinghuai didn't seem to need to rely on a cane to walk. She was mesmerized by it, but never expected that Pei Jinghuai would suddenly stand and turn around. "Have you finished your homework?" Being caught peeking, Ye Zhi panicked. She quickly averted her gaze from him and ran upstairs, bowing to him. Pei Jinghuai frowned and said, "Do you have anything else to do?" Ye Zhirang waved her hand and even stuttered as she spoke, No, good night, uncle." She turned around and ran to her room, stumbling on the ground because she was running too quickly. Pei Jinghuai tilted his head, with a hint of confusion in his amber-light eyes. Is he so terrifying? As for making children afraid like this. Ye Zhirang looked back awkwardly, only to see Pei Jinghuai still standing in place. Under the warm yellow light, his mixed-race face had more three-dimensional features, and whether he looked good or not, he had no expression. Ye Zhirang pushed open the door and stumbled over the threshold as he was about to enter. Pei Jinghuai shook his head helplessly as he watched her flurry of awkward movements. In early November, my aunt called to tell Ye Zhirang that they were going to take my grandmother back to Jiangqing. After hanging up the phone, Ye Zhirang stared at the dimly lit screen of his phone for a long time. Tears finally fell uncontrollably on the unfolded exercise book, blurring out the mathematical formula that had just been written. She raised her hand to wipe away her tears, but for some reason, the tears grew more and more. She restrained herself from crying and bit her lips, sobbing. Her gaze was fixed on the photo of her mother and grandmother next to the desk lamp. She smiled happily and was surrounded by them, holding a bouquet of sunflowers that her stepfather had given to her on the day of her junior high school graduation ceremony. This photo was also taken by her stepfather. At that time, she felt so happy, but now she feels so sad. The next morning, while going downstairs for breakfast, Mr. Pei noticed something was wrong with her and said, "Zhirang, what's wrong with you?" Ye Zhirang shook his head and said, "Grandpa, don't worry, I'm fine." Mr. Pei put down the newspaper in his hand and said, "I heard your grandmother is going to Jiangqing today. Do you need Grandpa to arrange a driver to take them off?" Ye Zhirang lowered his head in silence and looked at the bread and milk in front of him. After a while, he shook his head and said, "Aunt said they will come to school to see me at noon, and then Uncle will drive back to Jiangqing." Mr. Pei sighed and said, "It was indeed in a hurry." Because Aunt said that she would take her grandmother to see her at noon, Ye Zhirang didn't go to the cafeteria for lunch to wait for them. She sat in the classroom holding her phone, waiting for her aunt to call. After waiting for a long time, my phone didn't ring, and there were more and more classmates in the class. My desk mate Zong started happily discussing the latest basketball game with his desk mate as soon as he returned. Their happiness contrasted sharply with Ye Zhirang's disappointment and anxiety. Ye Zhirang turned his head and looked out the window. In November, Sioux City was still far from snowing, and he could still catch the tail of autumn. The trees on the campus were even dressed in late autumn, beautiful but also foreshadowing their impending decline. The lunch break was about to pass, but my phone never rang. Ye Zhirang sent several messages to his aunt in a row, and the replies he received were almost there. Wait a little longer. She looked down at her phone screen, her nose turning sour, and her heart was extremely sad. Song Jichuan, who was preparing for her lunch break, noticed her mistake and tentatively asked in a low voice, "Zhirang, your grandmother hasn't come yet?" Ye Zhirang nodded and said, "Wait a little longer." Song Jichuan hesitated and patted her shoulder, saying, "Don't be sad, maybe they might be delayed by something. They should be on their way here." Ye Zhirang tried his best to smile at him and said, "Hope." She turned on her phone, muted it, and put it in a drawer. The first class in the afternoon was physics, but Ye Zhi was biased towards her subject. She always struggled to understand mathematics, physics, and chemistry. In middle school, she even set a historical record of 16 points in the physics exam. Even the physics teacher exclaimed that she had been in the industry for more than 10 years and had never encountered a child who worked as hard as she did, but still couldn't achieve results. Ye Zhirang still remembers Tang Yi holding her 16-point physics test paper, her hands trembling. She lowered her head and didn't dare to see her mother's reaction, but to her surprise, Tang Hui was laughed at angrily and said, "Let me know, even if you are Duomeng, you should score more than 16 points on a few multiple-choice questions." Looking back on her mother's angry and helpless expression, Ye Zhirang still feels bitter in her heart. She was not a smart child since childhood, spoke later than others, studied slower than others, and always had a gentle and introverted personality. From kindergarten to now, I have been in school for over a decade. Except for my better grades in Chinese and English, everything else is not very good. I have always been in the middle of the class, but it seems that my luck was good at a critical time. During the middle school entrance exam, my character exploded and I went to an experimental high school. Tang Fun was happy for a long time at that time, and Pei Qingji was even more pleased with her decent grades and held a 3-day graduation banquet. The happy past seems to have been yesterday, but today there is nothing left. Halfway through class, the homeroom teacher knocked on the door and walked in. After briefly greeting the physics teacher, she turned her gaze to Ye Zhirang and waved at her, "Zhirang, come out for a moment." My desk mate Song Jichuan reacted quickly and excitedly bumped her arm. It must be your grandmother coming. Ye Zhirang smiled at him, got up, and almost ran out of the class gate. The homeroom teacher escorted her to the staircase and said, Zhirang, go and return quickly, don't delay class. Ye Zhirang nodded and said, thank you, teacher. She ran all the way to the school gate because the homeroom teacher had greeted her in advance, so as soon as she arrived, the gatekeeper opened the school gate. Auntie helped Grandma stand in front of the green belt by the roadside. As soon as Grandma saw her, tears blurred her eyes and she said, my dear, how are you doing at Pei's house? Ye Zhirang held his grandmother's hand and struggled to prevent himself from crying, saying, okay, everything is fine with me. Grandmother sighed and shook her head, it's because grandmother is incompetent. Grandmother is useless and cannot protect her. Ye Zhirang looked at her grandmother's already graying hair, and now her black hair was even scarcer. Her heart was even more sour. She hugged her grandmother and comforted her by patting her thin back, saying, Grandma, don't worry, I'm really doing well. When the holiday comes, I'll go to Jiangqing to see you. Auntie picked up the insulated bucket in her hand and said, this is the chicken soup that your grandmother cooked for you. You can take it back and eat it hot at night. Ye Zhirang let go of her grandmother and took the slightly old insulated bucket. As the parting approached, she didn't know what else to say for a moment. Chapter 4. Fear of him. You are listening at novel full.audio. Grandmother restrained herself and sobbed softly, while Aunt sighed. Uncle stood under a tree in the distance, smoking, with a worried expression on his face. After a while, my grandmother trembled and took out a bank card from her pocket, putting it into her hand. Let's make way, you'll be the only one in the future. You need to keep more money on you, so you don't have to ask anyone in case of trouble. My grandmother is also down to earth. Ye Zhirang held the bank card in his hand and looked at his aunt, who smiled at her and said, take it, this is also your grandmother's heart. As he spoke, he raised his hand and glanced at his watch, it's getting late. We have to leave now. You should also go back to class quickly. Learning is the most important thing, but we can't delay it. Upon hearing this, my grandmother was also busy pushing her and said, yes. We can't delay class. Ye Zhirang suppressed her tears and choked up with a sob. Under the gaze of her grandmother and aunt, she turned back 3 times and walked into the school gate, until the road to the school gate was almost out of sight. Behind her, her grandmother was still waving at her. This so-called farewell did not involve the embrace and tears she had imagined, and her grandmother seemed to have accepted the fact that she wanted to stay at the Pei family. Ye Zhirang felt more and more sad as she thought about it. She held the insulation bucket that had fallen off paint and stood under the shade of trees on campus, crying uncontrollably. At night after school, it was not the butler who came to pick up Ye Zhirang and go home, but Pei Jinghuai. He was wearing a long black trench coat and stood at the school gate expressionlessly. At a height of 193, he stood out from the crowd. Standing there was like taking a fashion film, and it was difficult not to see him. This eye-catching matter, like mathematics, physics, and chemistry, made Ye Zhi, who was used to being a little transparent, feel a headache. Her heart stopped for a moment, followed by an indescribable panic. She buried her head lower and even slowed down, hiding behind the crowd leaving the school gate. But it was obvious that Pei Jinghuai was here to pick her up. No matter how low her head was and how inconspicuous she was in her loose school uniform, she was still recognized by him at a glance. Fortunately, he didn't call her name, or maybe he didn't remember her at all. As she approached, Pei Jinghuai turned and walked towards the black Rolls-Royce parked on the roadside. Ye Zhirang followed silently behind him at a distance, lowered her head and quickly got into the car under the gaze of those around her. She didn't care if Pei Jinghuai also wanted to get in from this side, so she panicked and closed the car door. Due to the large amplitude of the movement, the sound of closing the car door was a bit loud, and she was also frightened and shivered. Pei Jinghuai stood outside the car door, sighed, and then obediently walked around the back of the car to get on the side near the road. The atmosphere inside the car was indeed somewhat awkward. Ye Zhirang blushed, lowered his head, timidly leaned against the car door, huddled in the seat, and his whole body resembled a stray cat accidentally grabbed onto the car by Pei Jinghuai's neck, sensitive, cowardly, and fearful. She was afraid of him, so she almost wrote it on her face. "It's quite late after school," Pei Jinghuai said in a plain tone, but it made Ye Zhi's heart panic. For a moment, many voices came to her mind, wondering if uncle had been waiting for too long. He won't be angry anymore, will he? What should she go back to? Under the influence of these voices, Ye Zhirang became even more panicked. She lowered her head and felt extremely cramped. If possible, she wanted to get off the car and escape from here now. Seat belts. Ah! Ye Zhirang was taken aback for a moment. After realizing it, he quickly took off his backpack and fastened his seatbelt. "I'm sorry, uncle." Pei Jinghuai glanced at her and said to the driver sitting in the front row, "You can go now." Ye Zhirang sat cramped against the car door, holding her backpack. She looked out the window and gradually realized that this was not the way home. She wanted to ask Pei Jinghuai where he was going now, but she was afraid that he would get annoyed if he asked too many questions. Due to too many concerns, she kept getting conflicted and even demonstrated in her mind many times how to ask him, what kind of answer he would have, and tried to convince herself that there was nothing to be afraid of. After much hesitation, Ye Zhirang tried to probe as naturally as possible and whispered, "Uncle, this is not the way home." Pei Jinghuai answered quickly, with a still faint tone. The old man didn't feel well this afternoon and went to the hospital. There's no one at home tonight, so let me pick you up. Where are we going now? Eating. Okay, actually, Ye Zhirang wanted to ask where to eat and what to eat, but he didn't dare to ask. Pei Jinghuai looked at her and frowned slightly. "What's on the ground? Why do you keep bowing your head?" "Ah. Yes. I'm sorry. You didn't do anything wrong, don't always apologize." "I'm sorry." Ye Zhirang buried his head lower. Pei Jinghuai sighed helplessly, and Ye Zhi's heart tightened again. She thought she must have made the uncle dislike her. She timidly glanced at Pei Jinghuai and met his scrutinizing gaze. At present, Ye Zhi had a strange idea that was out of place in his mind. The plaster statue in the art room frowned. This idea slightly eased her nervousness, but to be honest, Pei Jinghuai is really good looking. How did she say that? The fusion of Western bones and Eastern skin is just right. Ye Zhirang has never seen many people with mixed-race appearances, so Pei Jinghuai is a first-class beauty in her heart. Out of admiration for beauty and handsomeness, she couldn't help but boldly glanced at him a few more times, feeling a slight fever on her cheeks. Pei Jinghuai's eyebrows furrowed even deeper. After a while, he chuckled lightly and said, "Child, what other questions do you have?" Ye Zhirang shook her head and looked out the window. Through the glass window, she saw that Pei Jinghuai was no longer looking at her. Ye Zhirang felt that her actions earlier were foolish, so foolish that she felt a bit embarrassed. She covered her face and let out a silent sigh. During the evening rush hour, the roads were congested, and due to not having lunch, Ye Zhirang persisted in attending classes all afternoon. As a result, her stomach was very hungry and she kept purring. She hugged her backpack tightly, trying to suppress the increasingly loud purring sound, but the more she pressed down, the louder the purring sound became. In the quiet car, the subtle sounds were amplified again, along with her embarrassment. "Are you hungry?" Your grandmother and aunt came to see you at noon and didn't take you to dinner?" Pei Jinghuai asked. "There's not enough time." Pei Jinghuai raised his eyebrows meaningfully and didn't ask further, "Hold on for a while longer." "Okay." After about 10 minutes, when Ye Zhirang wanted to find a crack in the ground due to the growling of his stomach, the car stopped in front of the Wanjin Hotel under the Pei Group. The hotel manager had already been waiting at the door for a long time. The driver got off the car and helped Pei Jinghuai open the car door. Ye Zhirang didn't dare to delay and followed closely to get off the other side of the car door. She hugged her backpack and almost ran along with Pei Jinghuai. Pei Jinghuai's footsteps were very fast, so fast that just following him had already taken up all of Ye Zhirang's attention. She didn't have time to look around at how magnificent she was and how she was out of place here in the elevator. Ye Zhirang lowered her head and stood in the front position beside Pei Jinghuai. The elevator door reflected her and Pei Jinghuai's shadows, and she dared not look, feeling that she was not in the same world as him. She is still afraid of him. Chapter 5. Friends. You are listening at Novel Full.Audio. With a ding sound, the elevator door opened, and Ye Zhirang turned sideways and followed Pei Jinghuai out of the elevator. The manager took them to the suite on the top floor, opened the door, and Pei Jinghuai walked in. However, Ye Zhirang stood at the door for a long time without taking a step. He turned to look at her and said, "You'll stay here for dinner, do your homework, and sleep when you're tired. I have a social gathering downstairs." "Uncle. Won't we go home?" "There's no one at home. If you want to go back, I'll have the driver take you after dinner, but my suggestion is to stay here instead of going home. At least this place is not as big as home, so it's not as empty and scary." He is telling the truth. If she were to stay alone at the Pei family's old house, she would indeed be afraid. "I understand." Ye Zhirang lowered his head and entered the door. "Lift your head up, keep your back straight, and curl your waist in fear at a young age, like something." Pei Jinghuai took the backpack from her hand and casually placed it on the sofa. He said to the manager, "I'll go downstairs first. Whatever she wants to eat, you can arrange for her. It's important to be fast and help her prepare everything she needs for tonight's accommodation. You don't have to ask me what you want." "Yes, sir." Ye Zhirang grabbed his clothes and mustered the courage to ask, "Uncle, when will you be back?" Pei Jinghuai raised his hand and glanced at his watch, ready to leave. "Don't wait for me," he said. "Oh." Ye Zhirang lowered his head again. Pei Jinghuai frowned and said, "Are you afraid?" "No. I'm not afraid." Ye Zhirang shook his head. After she finished answering, Pei Jinghuai didn't ask any more questions and left without looking back. Being in a completely unfamiliar environment, she is actually a bit afraid. Ye Zhirang let out an inconspicuous sigh and sat down in front of the sofa, next to her backpack. The manager took the menu from the waiter beside her and handed it to her. "Miss Ye, what do you want to eat?" Ye Zhirang flipped back a few pages and hesitated. "Why don't you watch and do it? I'm not very picky about food." The manager didn't say much, so he took back the menu and said, "Could you please tell us which skincare brand and clothing size you are accustomed to using?" "Ah." Ye Zhirang reacted for a moment and said, "There's no specific brand. As for the size of the clothes." She looked down at herself and said, "If the size is right, size S." "Okay, I understand. Please wait a moment." "Thank you. By the way, can I ask you something?" "Please speak." She opened her backpack and took out the old insulation bucket that was out of place with the surrounding environment. She handed it to the manager and said, "Can you help me heat up the soup in the bucket? After heating it up, I'll put it back here." The manager took it with both hands and said, "Okay. Thank you." After the manager and the waiter left, the room became quiet. Ye Zhirang was finally relieved. She closed her bag and turned to look at the French window. Almost half of the night view of Sioux City was outside the window, and a section of river water separated Sioux City from Jiangcheng. Since the afternoon until now, she has never received any news from her aunt and grandmother again, and she doesn't know if they have arrived in Jiangcheng. Ye Zhirang took out his phone from his bag, and there were 38 unread messages displayed on the screen, all sent by his desk mate Zong. "Zhirang, I accidentally took away your exercise book after school. How about I help you write it?" Zong. "Zhirang, have you arrived home yet? Song Jichuan. Zhirang, have you eaten yet? Song Jichuan. Zhirang, the English teacher said which unit of words will be dictated tomorrow. Song Jichuan. Who is the person who came to pick you up today? Ye Zhirang looked at this long string of messages and didn't know which question to answer first. At school, Song Jichuan can be considered the person who has the best relationship with her. He has a good personality, good grades, is tall and handsome. He can play basketball, draw, play piano, and even write well. Not only that, he is also the flag bearer and student representative of the school, deeply loved by teachers and pursued by classmates. It is said that even his family background is impeccable. His father is the director of the First People's Hospital in Sucheng, and he is also a renowned cardiologist in the country. His mother is a professor in the law department of Sucheng University, and he has a perfect family with high knowledge. A dazzling person like Song Jichuan, originally Ye Zhirang was afraid to approach, but on the first day of high school registration, she coincidentally formed a desk mate with Song Jichuan. Song Jichuan was like a small sun, seemingly inspired to let his light envelop everyone around him. As his desk mate, Ye Zhirang couldn't escape. During military training not long ago, Ye Zhirang was taken care of by him. Whether it was secretly giving her yogurt, or bringing cookies and chocolates from somewhere unknown, or as the class monitor, he secretly poured water while helping the instructor observe the military posture, causing Ye Zhirang, who couldn't stand, to sway left and right with non-standard movements and rest. Previously, when classmates saw the news of Ye Zhi's parents being murdered, they had a lot of discussions about her, and it was Song Jichuan who helped her quell it. Because of his kindness to her, there were countless rumors circulating, and even some good guys were cheering in front of them. Ye Zhirang was most afraid of this kind of thing, and Song Jichuan didn't like it either. With his usual good temper, he got angry and warned the troublemaker seriously. Ye Zhirang thinks that Song Jichuan is really good. She used her girlish thoughts to think that perhaps Song Jichuan liked her, but as soon as this idea came up, she urgently called it off. How could someone like Song Jichuan, who is so dazzling and good, possibly like her? He is good to her just because he is good to everyone. He is a very good person and a loyal friend, that's all. Ye Zhirang replied, "Don't help me write the exercise book, otherwise tomorrow the teacher will find that the handwriting is different and it will be even more troublesome." English dictation is the third unit and the text we talked about in class today. Song Jichuan replied quickly. "Have you arrived home yet?" Ye Zhirang hesitated for a moment and said, "That's it. My uncle went to pick me up today." Song Jichuan. Uncle. Ye Zhirang. Well, they are my stepfather's younger brother, they are half-siblings. Song Jichuan. So it's like this. When you get home, I feel at ease. By the way, my mom baked cookies today, they were really delicious. Do you prefer milk-flavored ones or chocolate-flavored ones? Ye Zhirang. Don't bring it to me, I'm too sorry. Song Jichuan replied with a smiling puppy emoji. I guess you all like it. Let's not say it for now, I have to go do my homework. Ye Zhirang. Okay. She flipped through the chat records with Song Jichuan and slowly raised her lips. Song Jichuan is really good, and no one should dislike him. Ye Zhirang put down her phone and waited for a while before the doorbell rang. She got up and opened the door. The manager and waiter brought her dinner, along with the sales staff from the luxury goods store downstairs. They brought carefully selected clothes and skincare products for Ye Zhirang to choose from. Ye Zhirang had never seen such a big battle before. She sat on the sofa feeling nervous and helpless, listening to the salesperson's enthusiastic and appropriate recommendations of the products she brought. Ye Zhirang was confused and thought everything was good, but he was afraid of being too expensive and didn't dare to choose. The manager who had been waiting on the side noticed her concerns and said, "Miss Ye, this is Mr. S. arrangement. You can all stay." Ah. No need, no need. Ye Zhirang waved his hand. The manager didn't listen to her and asked the salesperson to leave everything behind. Miss Ye, please have a meal. The manager made a gesture of invitation to her. After finishing her meal, Ye Zhirang simply tidied up the plate. She held the chicken soup that her grandmother had cooked for her and walked to the living room. She sat down on the carpet next to the coffee table and started drinking chicken soup while doing homework. After finishing writing, it was almost 12 o'clock. She memorized the vocabulary for a while, packed her backpack, picked out a set of clothes and toiletries, and walked into a relatively small bedroom. Before going to bed, she opened her phone and glanced at it. Half an hour ago, Song Jichuan sent her a good night message. Ye Zhirang rubbed his phone screen and replied, "Good night. Song Jichuan. Just getting ready to sleep. Don't bring such a roll. Never mind, don't come back to me. Come and go, it's even later. Anyway, it's a good dream. See you tomorrow." Ye Zhirang chuckled and left the chat page, set the alarm, and closed her eyes. Perhaps because she was too tired today, she fell asleep shortly after. As for when Pei Jinghuai returned and whether he has ever returned, Ye Zhirang has no idea at all. Chapter 6. Parents. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. The next morning, after breakfast, Pei Jinghuai's driver took her to school. For a whole week afterwards, she stayed at the hotel and was picked up by car every morning and evening. Someone helped clean her school uniform, and every other day or two, a salesperson downstairs would bring new clothes. Only Pei Jinghuai remained absent. On Friday, Ye Zhirang returned to the hotel after school. While eating, Pei Jinghuai came back and sat down at the dining table. He picked up a kettle, poured a glass of water, and took a sip. "Are you doing well?" Ye Zhirang put down his chopsticks and nodded, "It's okay." He nodded and said, "You can go home tomorrow. Grandpa has been discharged from the hospital." "Well, but the situation is not good, you should be mentally prepared. In the future, this kind of day following me may become the norm before you go to college." "What does that mean?" Ye Zhirang's heart suddenly tugged. Pei Jinghuai frowned, trying to conceal his emotions. The old man is in the late stage of colon cancer, and there is not much time left. Everyone in the family must revolve around him, and it will be troublesome for you to go back. The 4 words, late-stage colon cancer, exploded in Ye Zhirang's mind. Her eyes were immediately filled with tears. So kind Grandpa Pei, such a good person, why Pei Jinghuai looked at her and thought she was worried about the future. The old man has told me that the Pei family doesn't lack a pair of chopsticks. You should follow me in the future, go to school, do what you should do, and you won't starve to death. Ye Zhirang lowered his head and sobbed softly, "That's not what I meant." Pei Jinghuai was stunned for a moment, then suddenly smiled and said, "Is that not important? As long as you understand what I'm saying, I don't have much patience and haven't taken care of children. So, except for money issues, don't bother me with anything else you can solve on your own. Do you understand?" Ye Zhirang nodded and said, "I know. I know. Lift your head and don't put on a submissive expression in front of me." "Yes, I understand, uncle." Ye Zhirang slowly looked up, tears hanging on his cheeks, and tried to squeeze a smile at him. "Even worse than crying, don't laugh." That night, Pei Jinghuai was always there. After finishing his meal, Ye Zhirang lay on the table doing his homework, while he sat on the other side working. The two of them didn't disturb each other, just like two strangers who accidentally shared a table. Perhaps it was originally a stranger. Until Ye Zhirang took out a math test paper from the math book that required parental signature, the big red 59 on the paper made her feel embarrassed to ask Pei Jinghuai to sign it. She looked at the exam paper with a worried expression and sighed. It was certain that parents would sign it. If they didn't sign it today, they would have to sign it in the next 2 days. If Pei Jinghuai wasn't here, she wouldn't be able to ask Grandpa Pei to sign it. Grandpa Pei is already in poor health. If she gets angry again because she scored 59 in math, how can she afford it? Find the butler to sign. The butler will definitely tell Grandpa Pei. Ye Zhirang felt more and more ashamed as she thought about it. She lowered her head and sighed again, beginning to blame herself for not being able to score a few more points. Unable to do anything about it, she hesitated for a moment and finally looked up at Pei Jinghuai, who was focused on his work. She tentatively called out, "Uncle." But because the voice was too low and Pei Jinghuai was too focused, he didn't respond. Ye Zhirang tried to call him again. Pei Jinghuai frowned and said, "What's wrong?" Ye Zhirang stood up with a test paper and walked up to him, timidly saying, "Uncle, can you help me sign my name?" Pei Jinghuai glanced at the exam paper in her hand and said, "Let me take a look." Ye Zhirang handed the test paper carefully to him. As expected, Pei Jinghuai's originally displeased face turned black when he saw the big 59 points. 150 points, are you taking the 59? I'm a bit off topic, not very good at math, physics, and chemistry. Pei Jinghuai turned over the test paper and looked at the section of the big question that was written to the brim but couldn't be answered. His brow furrowed even tighter and he said, "It's all so difficult for you to come up with so many formulas that don't match your words." He put down his paper and reached out his hand to Ye Zhirang, saying, "Pen." Ye Zhirang backed to his seat and picked out a new black neutral pen from his pencil case, handing it to him. Pei Jinghuai took it and opened the lid, signing his name next to the red 59 points. Ye Zhirang looked at it, feeling relieved in his heart but also inexplicably feeling guilty. The 3 words Pei Jinghuai may have never suffered such injustice in his life, and the crown prince of the Pei family himself probably has never seen such a low score. After signing, Pei Jinghuai closed his pen cap and flipped back and forth through Ye Zhirang's exam paper. 59 points, what level is it in your class? 10th from the bottom. Ye Zhirang lowered his head in shame. Pei Jinghuai raised his eyebrows lightly, saying nothing, but it seemed like he had said everything. He returned the test paper to Ye Zhirang and said, "Don't keep nodding and bowing. Also, let's not do it again." "Sorry, uncle." She held the paper and waited for Pei Jinghuai's next reprimand. But Pei Jinghuai asked, "Do you have anything else to do?" "No, no more." The next morning, Pei Jinghuai took her back to the Pei family's old house. When he returned, he happened to catch up with Mr. Pei having breakfast. Seeing Ye Zhirang, Mr. Pei's mental state clearly improved a lot. He asked them to sit down and had the butler bring new bowls and chopsticks. "Did you have a good week?" Mr. Pei asked with a kind smile. "Grandpa, everything is fine with me, but I'm worried about you. When I called you, I happened to catch you resting every time, and I don't know about your situation." As Ye Zhirang spoke, her voice became quieter. Pei Jinghuai looked at her as if she was about to cry again and scolded, "Lift your head up and speak well." With such a cold voice from him, Ye Zhi added a touch of shyness to the face of Wei Chu Baba. Mr. Pei sighed and said, "Jinghuai, you can be considered an elder now. You're not young, but you're quite arrogant. You're eating here. Why are you scolding her?" "Dad, since you said you wanted me to take care of her, I would have been her guardian before she reached adulthood. She is 16 years old, not 6 years old, not lacking in food and clothing, and nothing worse than others, but always looking timid and hesitant, like what?" Ye Zhirang buried his head lower, his nose turning sour, and tears streaming down his face. "Why are you crying?" Pei Jinghuai said coldly. She quickly wiped away 2 tears and shook her head, saying, "I didn't cry." "Then lift your head up and keep your back straight." Ye Zhirang sat up straight. Mr. Pei smiled helplessly and said, all right, let's all eat, let's eat." Ye Zhirang picked up his chopsticks and obediently waited for Mr. Pei to move them first. During the conversation, Mr. Pei asked her about some things related to her study in life. Ye Zhirang was very afraid that Pei Jinghuai would tell Grandpa Pei about her math score of 59, so she was always very nervous. Whenever she was nervous, she would talk a lot, rambling around and talking about something. As she chatted, she mentioned that their school had recently collaborated with their sister school, Jiangqing No. 1 Middle School, to hold an extracurricular activity to make pen friends. She said it was to enrich students' extracurricular life and allow them to experience the charm of text and letters in this era of rapid development of electronic products. Mr. Pei developed a strong interest in this, and even told Pei Jinghuai and Ye Zhirang about his youth, including the story of how he and his beloved girl got to know each other through letters. As he spoke, Mr. Pei's face showed a look of sadness. Ye Zhi was a bit confused until Mr. Pei finally said, "Unfortunately, this person has passed away. Apart from those letters, I don't have any more thoughts about her now." With a bitter smile, he looked at Ye Zhirang with a hint of tears in his eyes. His gaze was deep, as if trying to see others through her. Ye Zhirang guessed that the person in the mouth of Master Pei's son was probably the mother of her stepfather, Pei Qingji. Master Pei is now kind to her because he misses his own son, which is equivalent to the thoughts left by his stepfather for Master Pei. Zhirang, such activities are meaningful. Life is all about experiencing, maintaining curiosity, trying everything, and maybe there may be unexpected gains. If you can get a friend from a letter, it is also a blessing in life. After chatting with Mr. Pei, Ye Zhirang, who was originally lacking in interest in making pen friends, decided to participate in this event. Chapter 7. Pen Friends. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. On Monday morning, after finishing morning reading, Ye Zhirang went to the office to ask the Chinese teacher for a pen pal selection form. Due to the intense academic pressure in high school and the fact that communicating with strangers doesn't sound very reliable, so since the event was officially launched last week, there have been few people willing to participate. Ye Zhirang is usually seen by teachers as a student with an overly obedient and introverted personality, with average grades and no particularly outstanding talents. She is almost transparent in the class, so the Chinese teacher was very surprised that she was willing to participate in the activity of making pen friends. I couldn't help but ask her one more question: why are you willing to participate? Ye Zhirang grabbed the selection table in his hand and thought for a moment, because of my grandfather. The Chinese teacher didn't ask any more questions, only reminded her to make a good choice. Returning to the class, Ye Zhirang carefully read the selection table and hesitated to choose the pen at the bottom of the table called ! The gender was unknown and he was currently a humanities student in the second year of Jiangqing No. 1 Middle School, as his future pen friend. All day long, she was thinking about what she could write to strangers. What kind of person is the ? He is studying at Jiangqing No. 1 Middle School and is definitely very good at learning. He is also willing to actively participate in such activities, so he must be a good learner, with a cheerful and optimistic personality, and positive and upward. In short, it must be someone completely different from her, a friend she dares not get too close to in reality, just like her desk mate Zong. With this thought in mind, Ye Zhirang not only retreated but also added some anticipation of becoming a pen pal with ! Zong took out the selection list from her hand and jokingly said, "Are these people reliable? If you really want to write a letter, why not write it to me? You write one letter, I reply to 10 letters, and I'll read it to you in person. Whatever you want to write, I'll take it." Ye Zhirang retrieved the selection table and carefully smoothed out the creases made by Zong, saying, "Don't talk nonsense, who will write you a love letter?" Zong blushed and smiled, "If you don't write, then don't write. This old trick is not uncommon to me, young master." He touched his nose bridge and glanced at Ye Zhirang. Ye Zhirang frowned and didn't pay attention to him anymore. Rarely after school, Zong carried a backpack on one shoulder and followed Ye Zhirang, who was walking hurriedly, into the stationery store next to the school. Ye Zhirang stood in front of the shelf selling stationery, bent down, and carefully selected the stationery. "What are you doing with me? Aren't you going home?" Zong Jichuan picked up the electric eraser placed on the top shelf and shook it at her, saying, "Buy a piece of eraser. That's not very useful. Then you choose for me." Ye Zhirang didn't lift her head and continued flipping through the letterhead. "Just buy the cheapest one, fancy ones are usually not practical." She picked up 2 carefully selected packages of letterhead and compared them left and right, saying, "Which one looks good?" Zong Jichuan put down the eraser in his hand and pointed to the shelf. "Do you believe in light?" Ye Zhirang followed the direction of his fingers and saw the naive Ultraman letterhead on the shelf that was first excluded by her. She pursed her lips and stacked the letterheads in her hand, saying, "I shouldn't have asked you." She then turned around and went to the checkout to check out. "No vision," Zong Jichuan murmured softly, reaching out to pick up the package of Ultraman letterhead and casually taking an eraser to keep up with her. Coming out of the stationery store, Ye Zhirang stood by the roadside waiting for the driver to pick him up. Zong Jichuan was not in a hurry either. He stood beside Ye Zhirang and slowly put the letter and eraser into his backpack. Ye Zhirang looked at him and said, "Do you also want to participate in the activity?" "I'm not interested in writing letters to strangers." He packed his backpack and put his hand into the pocket of his dark brown and khaki patchwork baseball jacket. "I'm planning to keep it for writing love letters." Ye Zhirang was amused by him and said, "Do you still use to write love letters?" Everyone is equal in the face of love, who is nobler than whom?" Ye Zhirang smiled and glanced at her phone. Zong Jichuan peeked at her and cleared his throat. "What?" "Ye Zhirang. What's wrong?" Ye Zhirang looked up, and Zong Jichuan avoided the gaze that was staring at her. "Writing a letter is not allowed, but early love is not allowed. Don't blame me for being too lenient. We are desk mates, and you are always clumsy. I'm afraid you'll be deceived." Ye Zhirang pushed him and said, "You're so stupid. You're so stupid." Zong Jichuan smiled and lightly pushed back, "You are the first in the world, and I am the second in the world. Big brother, not to mention second brother." During the fight, a familiar black Rolls-Royce stopped in front of Ye Zhirang, and the car window slowly lowered. Ye Zhirang quickly suppressed his smile, withdrew his hand from playing with Zong Jichuan, and respectfully lowered his head to call out, "Uncle." Zong Jichuan turned his head and met Pei Jinghuai's serious scrutinizing gaze. "Hello, Uncle. I am Zhirang's friend, Zong Jichuan." Pei Jinghuai's cold eyes moved away and said, "Ye Zhirang, don't you get on the car yet? Are you planning to walk home?" Ye Zhirang hurriedly opened the car door and said, "Zong Jichuan, hurry home too. See you tomorrow." Zong Jichuan waved his hand and said, "See you tomorrow." After Ye Zhirang got on the car, Zong Jichuan waved his hand as he wanted to lower the car window and rush back to the original position. However, the car window couldn't open. Pei Jinghuai said expressionlessly to the driver, "Drive." After the car drove, Zong Jichuan also turned around and left. Ye Zhirang held his backpack and kept a safe distance from Pei Jinghuai like a quail, huddled in the seat. "Aren't you quite happy just now? Talking and laughing with the furry guy, leaving me speechless." "Uncle, he's not a kid, he's my friend, he's very impressive." Pei Jinghuai raised his eyebrows lightly, his displeasure growing stronger. "You'd better know what you can do and what you can't do," he said, "we are just friends. It's best to do so." Ye Zhirang dared not look at him and lowered her head. "We are really just friends," she whispered as she spoke. But the more she explained, the more outraged Pei Jinghuai, who was too deeply involved in the role of the parent, became when she felt that her own cabbage had been tricked by a pig. "Excuse me." After finishing his homework, Ye Zhirang started writing the first letter to be sent to the exclamation mark. For the first time writing a letter in her life, Ye Zhi nervously picked up her pen and didn't know what to write. She deleted, edited, and revised it, writing 7 or 8 pages of waste, and finally managed to write it into a letter. She held a thin piece of paper and read it carefully 5 or 6 times under the light of the desk lamp. At the end of the letter, she added a sentence. Congratulations to the auspicious season, autumn, sway, and winter. After finishing writing, she carefully folded the letter paper and put it in a craft paper envelope, along with a golden ginkgo leaf that she had stuffed into the book to make a specimen. After affixing the stamp, she carefully unfolded the envelope and wrote her address and pen name, Ye. All night, she slept restlessly because she was too excited. She kept imagining whether the exclamation mark would be as excited as her when she received the letter, what his expression would be when he opened the letter, what he would write in the reply, and whether the exclamation mark was a boy or a girl. The more she thought about it, the more confused her mind became. She even dreamed that she was writing a letter, but what Ye Zhirang is most worried about is still the fear of not receiving a reply. The next morning, before going to school, she tried to restrain the urge to back down and handed the letter to the butler, asking him to send it on her behalf. The process of waiting for a reply was very agonizing. For a whole week, Ye Zhirang was in a state of both anticipation and nervousness. Every day when she came home from school, she would ask the butler if there were any letters from her today. The butler's daily response is without exception. Mr. Pei comforted her and said that waiting should be treated as a form of enjoyment, so that the experience would be complete. Chapter 8. Errors. You are listening at Novel Full.Audio. Ye Zhirang waited patiently for another weekend, but on Monday afternoon after school, when Pei Jinghuai came to pick her up, he said Grandpa Pei was hospitalized again and she had to continue following him. Ye Zhirang was both sad and disappointed, and what made her even more frightened was that Pei Jinghuai did not take her to the hotel this time, but instead went to his private residence in Mingyu Bay, located in the precious land of Suzhou City. The 43rd floor has a duplex structure with 2 floors, covering a large area. The decoration is in the style of a model room, and the furniture is complete, but it just feels very empty. It seems that Pei Jinghuai has never lived here before. Ye Zhirang stood at the door with a backpack in her arms. She looked down at the dark blue men's slippers at her feet, hesitating whether to change them. Pei Jinghuai changed into the shoes and glanced at her. Let's make do for it first. Later, the butler will have your things delivered. Ah. Bring them all over. Uncle, won't I go home? Pei Jinghuai was a bit impatient. He frowned slightly and said, the old man's situation is not good. When you go back, he still has to worry about you. I am usually busy with work and don't have time to pick you up every 3 days or 2, so living under my nose is the best choice. I'm sorry, Uncle. Actually, I can live on campus, or I can go back to my grandmother's house to take care of myself. Ye Zhirang placed his backpack on a soft leather bench next to him, bent down, and changed into those slippers that didn't fit well. Can you take care of yourself? Pei Jinghuai smiled and said, Ye Zhirang, there are many dangers in this world, and girls need to learn to protect themselves. Living in school is a good choice, but have you ever lived in school? Returning to your grandmother's house is not close to the school you attended, and it is an old community with average security. In recent years, old residents have moved and most of the houses have been rented. It's not an exaggeration to say that there is a mix of good and bad. If something happens when you live back, how can I explain it to your elders? I'm sorry, Uncle. Looking up, since the old man asked me to take care of you, you must abide by my rules, listen to me, and not be submissive. Unless there are any accidents, we will stay here for a long time. Starting from this week, there will be a tutor coming to help you with your homework. You can go out to play on weekends, where to go, and with whom, report in advance, and I will have the driver pick you up. You must go home before 8 p.m. at night, without any reason or reason. Don't feel unfriendly because I really don't want your freedom to cause me trouble. I know, Uncle. Ye Zhirang raised his head, but his eyes remained low, afraid to look at him. Pei Jinghuai turned around and walked towards the house. Follow me. Ye Zhirang let out a silent sigh. She quickly picked up her backpack and ran behind him, her uncomfortable slippers falling off with each step, feeling somewhat embarrassed. Pei Jinghuai turned his head to look at her feet and slowed down his pace. You can enter and exit the public area on the first floor as you please, but don't go into my study. Every morning and evening, a nanny comes to cook. You can ask her what you want to eat. There is an empty room on the left side of the second floor, you can choose one to live in. Around the living room, Ye Zhirang followed Pei Jinghuai upstairs. Also, I don't like strangers coming to my house, so don't bring friends as guests, especially your friend named Zong. Zong Jichuan. Pei Jinghuai raised his hand and said, it's not important. He stood at the staircase and said, you can go back to your room now to do your homework. When dinner is ready, someone will come up to call you. Thank you, uncle. Ye Zhirang, holding his backpack and intentionally maintaining an awkward posture of raising his head and chest, passed in front of Pei Jinghuai and, like escaping, pushed open the door near the staircase. He ran in without looking back and slammed the door shut. She trembled in fear because the door closed too loudly. The room is large, with independent bathroom, cloakroom, desk, bed, and a French window. The scenery outside the window is also good. Ye Zhirang placed her backpack on the desk near the window. She took off her thick coat and strolled around the room to familiarize herself with the environment. In fact, the uncle just seems to be difficult to get along with, but in reality, he is quite nice. He has never been hungry before, and he has never been late for picking her up or dropping her off. He also bought her beautiful clothes, signed her math test paper with a score of 59, and even hired a tutor for her without asking. She has never experienced the panic of being placed under someone else's protection and being driven away if she is not careful. It is the utmost kindness and righteousness to be able to do such a thing to a stranger, let alone to say that she is still Ye Han's daughter. With this thought in mind, Ye Zhirang's admiration for Pei Jinghuai increased in addition to his fear. After all, contentment and happiness are the key to survival. After finishing her meal, near 12 o'clock, the staff at the old house brought her luggage over. Ye Zhi reminded her of the letter she had sent, and she hesitated to ask if her family had received the letter sent to her. The staff replied that there was no such thing. Ye Zhi expressed his gratitude in disappointment. Pei Jinghuai helped her carry her suitcase upstairs and asked coldly, is that how you want to receive a reply from a stranger? Ye Zhirang didn't expect him to ask, yes. I'm a bit excited. Pei Jinghuai placed his suitcase at the door of the room and said, are you afraid of me? Ye Zhirang shook her head and tightly clenched the corner of her clothes, saying in a sincere tone as much as possible, no, uncle is good-looking and not scary at all. However, her slightly trembling voice still exposed her nervousness at the moment. Good-looking. Pei Jinghuai seemed interested in her answer. Ye Zhi instinctively took a step back and said, well, it looks great, but my personality is slow and hot, so my uncle may think I'm afraid of you. As for that letter, I really want to receive it because it's my first time writing a letter and making friends with strangers, so I'm really looking forward to it. What if we don't receive it? Ye Zhirang lowered his head, rubbed his eyes, looked pitiful, and his voice decreased a bit. It's okay if I can't receive it. I'm a stranger from the beginning, and I have the right to make friends with him. Of course, he also has the right to refuse me, which is normal. Just think about it, tidy up and go to bed early. Good night, uncle. On Friday afternoon, Ye Zhirang received her first tutoring session. In order to test her weak subjects, the tutoring teacher conducted a comprehensive test for her. The test results were not satisfactory, and Pei Jinghuai's face turned black when she saw her math grades. Ye Zhirang also felt embarrassed, but she did her best. If she wasn't good at it, she was not good at it, and there was really nothing she could do. Based on her current grades and knowledge mastery, as well as her future choices in humanities and sciences, the tutoring teacher said that she will provide a customized tutoring plan for her next week, and before leaving, she will be left with the exam exercises she needs to complete for the next week. The next morning, Ye Zhirang followed Pei Jinghuai to the hospital to visit Mr. Pei. Mr. Pei has lost a lot of weight again, and seeing them has greatly improved his mental state. Ye Zhirang spoke with him in the ward, while Pei Jinghuai followed the butler to the doctor's office to inquire about the situation. The doctor said that based on Mr. Pei's current situation, it is not recommended to undergo surgery or radiation therapy again. His life is also undergoing a countdown of 3 months, 6 months, and a maximum of 1 year. Actually, this result could have been anticipated earlier, but Pei Jinghuai didn't expect it to be so fast. After listening, the butler's eyes immediately turned red. Coming out of the office, Pei Jinghuai sat in the hallway for a long time holding Mr. Pei's inspection report. The butler stood by the wall for a while, and suddenly remembered something. He trembled and took out a half-folded envelope from his coat pocket, saying, "Third young master, this is a letter that Miss Ye asked me to help send out before, but it was returned due to an incorrect address. I was originally planning to give it to her, but I have been in the hospital for a while and haven't paid attention to it. You see, why don't you help hand it over to her?" Pei Jinghuai took the envelope and frowned at the address written on it, saying, "Is it possible that she wrote the wrong address?" Chapter 9. Burdens. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Miss Ye didn't write it wrong, because I read the selection form issued by their school, and the address on it was 184 Wudongli, Jiangcheng. But according to the feedback from the express company, there was only 183 Wudongli, Jiangcheng. As for the receiving phone number, it was also a blank number. The address and phone number were wrong, and it was impossible to find anyone in Jiangcheng No. 1 middle school, so this letter could only be returned to Miss Ye. Pei Jinghuai nodded and stood up. "I understand. I'll give it to her later." In the ward, Ye Zhirang was chatting with Mr. Pei. It was rare that Mr. Pei was in good spirits, and the grandparents and grandchildren were chatting and laughing happily. When Pei Jinghuai pushed the door in, the grandparents and grandchildren were chatting about history. Pei Jinghuai folded the report sheet in his hand and put it into the pocket of his black coat. His worried expression swept away and his usual indifference returned. He sat down on the chair next to the hospital bed and glanced at Ye Zhirang, who was timid and lowered his head. He said to Mr. Pei, "Dad, the doctor said that everything is going well at the moment and you should take good care of yourself according to the doctor's advice. There is no major problem." Mr. Pei shook his head with a smile and said, "I'm not sure what I'm like. Jinghuai, you don't have to hide it from me like they do." As he reached out, Pei Jinghuai respectfully picked up the water glass placed on the bedside table and handed it to him. "Dad, please rest assured." Mr. Pei took a sip of water and said, "I feel relieved. The doctors have already told me that even with my illness, I can still maintain my current state, which is stronger than many of my patients. After all, my age is here and I just need to endure. I just thought that walking from the hospital is better than walking from home, at least. It will cause less trouble." Ye Zhirang listened, feeling sad from the bottom of her heart. She silently lowered her head. Mr. Pei put down his water glass and looked at Ye Zhirang, saying, "I'm worried about this child now. Back then, your elder brother and Tang Fenian had a deep affection, but I was constrained by my high hopes for your elder brother and my so-called views on family. I didn't agree to let them be together, which wasted your elder brother's generation and also Tang Fenian. It's because I have a bad relationship with them." Ye Zhirang raised her hand and wiped the corner of her eyes, wanting to cry but not daring. She pitifully raised her eyes and happened to meet Pei Jinghuai's warning gaze. Ye Zhirang was a bit scared and was busy trying to hold back from crying. Mr. Pei looked at Pei Jinghuai and said, "When you were in your teens, I sent you abroad. You haven't been home for many years, and now that you are still young, there is no one to rely on at home. The huge Pei family can only rely on you to support it, which is really hard. But as a father, I still have an heartfelt request. I know that Rang is a good child, and I owe you a debt to your elder brother and her mother. I personally promised to take care of her, but now that I am on the brink of death, I am truly powerless. Jinghuai, I hope you will take care of her more in the future. Pei Jinghuai nodded and said, Dad, don't worry. Big brother used to treat me well, and the Pei family is not afraid of having an extra pair of chopsticks. I will live up to my expectations. Mr. Pei took his hand with satisfaction and said, Good child, thank you for being willing to share the debt with me. As he spoke, he extended his hand to Ye Zhirang, who quickly grasped it and said, Grandpa. Mr. Pei's eyes lit up with tears, and he said with reluctance, Zhirang, listen to your uncle's advice in the future, study hard, get into a good university, find a good job, and live a down-to-earth life. Grandpa. I know, don't worry. Mr. Pei clenched their hands tightly and said, As long as you're all good. After finishing lunch, Mr. Pei fell asleep. The butler escorted Pei Jinghuai and Ye Zhirang out of the ward and said, Third young master, Miss Ye, don't worry. With me here to guard, I will definitely take good care of Mr. Pei. Thank you, Pei Jinghuai said. It should be. The elevator door slowly closed, and Ye Zhirang's tears, which had been held back for a long time, finally came down uncontrollably. She was afraid of being scolded by Pei Jinghuai and dared not cry, so she could only lower her head. As soon as the tears fell, she quickly lifted her hand to wipe them off, but the more she wanted to cover them up, the more uncontrollable she wanted to cry. Pei Jinghuai watched her flustered appearance without saying a word. On the way home, Ye Zhirang kept crying. She felt sad for Grandpa Pei, missed her mother, grandmother, and her good stepfather Pei Qingji. The more she thought about it, the more sad she became. Pei Jinghuai took out a handkerchief from his pocket and handed it to her. Ye Zhirang wiped away 2 tears with force, carefully took the handkerchief, and timidly said sorry. Pei Jinghuai sighed and said, If you want to cry now, just cry. No one asks you to be strong. I'm sorry, Ye Zhirang wiped his tears with his handkerchief. Pei Jinghuai's handkerchief had a faint fragrance, resembling the scent of autumn leaves. Ye Zhirang didn't know how to describe it, but this scent seemed to have a magical power that could make her feel at ease. Sorry uncle, I didn't mean to say I'm sorry to you, she sobbed. Pei Jinghuai lowered his eyes and rubbed the silver snake on his cane, saying, Cry, this time only. When I go home later, what should I do? Don't trouble me. Ye Zhirang nodded and finally burst into tears. Along the way, she cried and Pei Jinghuai listened quietly. As she was about to get home, she once again mentioned to Pei Jinghuai that she could go to live on campus next semester. Pei Jinghuai glanced at her and said, Did you have a good time at school? Ye Zhirang was stopped by him. Her life at school, if it used to be ordinary and transparent, now, after Ye Han's incident, can be considered standing at the forefront of the storm. Although no one openly treats her, the strange looks her classmates sometimes cast at her still make her feel like walking on thin ice and uncomfortable. She shook her head and said, We can overcome it. Pei Jinghuai paused and said coldly, Don't cause too much trouble, stay honest. Ye Zhirang let out his anger and said, I'm sorry, uncle. I'm a burden and have caused you trouble. Lift your head up, keep your back straight. How many times do you want me to remind you? I'm sorry. Pei Jinghuai looked at her tearless expression, helplessly and irritably turned his head to look out the window, and said forget it. Ye Zhirang carefully lowered his head and wiped his tears with the handkerchief given by Pei Jinghuai. The deep blue handkerchief was soaked and mottled by the tears. Returning home, the nanny had already prepared lunch. While eating, Pei Jinghuai remembered the letter that was still in his pocket. He wanted to tell Ye Zhirang that the letter had been returned, indicating that her tears were mixed with rice, and she was trying to suppress her sobs, which was really pitiful. He dare not imagine how she would cry if she found out in her current state that she had been deceived by making a pen friend. Pei Jinghuai's heart softened for a moment, and the words on his lips were swallowed back. Throughout the weekend, Ye Zhirang was very sad, and her small face, which was already a rare smile, was full of sadness. Pei Jinghuai looked at it and felt like she could cry at any moment. To be honest, he had never seen such a crying child before. On Monday night after school, the driver took Ye Zhirang back home. After finishing her meal, the tutor came to her door and started tutoring her. After 2 hours of math class, she was already dizzy and had a headache, but when she turned her head to look at the pile of unfinished homework on the table, it was even more headache-inducing. What is the use of having a headache? Should I write it or should I finish it? She was very tired as she picked up her pen and started doing her homework. Her phone vibrated several times, and it was a message sent by Zong Jichuan. She didn't have time to read it. At 1:30 in the morning, she finally completed her last English reading comprehension, put down her pen, leaned back on the chair with her hands down, and looked at the ceiling. In her mind, she recalled the words that Grandpa Pei had told her to study hard and strive to live the life she wanted. What kind of life does she want? Ye Zhi made himself unaware. Chapter 10. First reply. You are listening at novel full.audio. When she was a child, she watched her mother and Yi Han arguing endlessly about money, thinking that it would be great if she could have money. She has to earn a lot of money, take her mother away from that suffocating home, buy her a big house, beautiful clothes and jewelry, and replace the bottom-worn bag that her mother has been carrying for nearly a decade. My mother likes traveling, so she accompanies her to see many scenery and also takes my grandmother with her. I want to buy a good feng shui cemetery for my grandfather who has passed away for many years, take him back from the ashes storage in the funeral home, and bury him in peace. She even thought of her aunt's family. Leaving fantasy, she is still the ordinary and hopeful child who has no idea what she can do for the future later. My mother divorced and remarried, and my stepfather was very wealthy. He bought a big house, beautiful clothes, and jewelry for my mother. My mother never carried that peeling bag again, and even my grandfather's grave was taken care of by my stepfather. My grandmother also has free money and leisure time to participate in the Sunset Red travel group, and can travel happily. As for her, she has never heard of endless arguments again, and her daily worries are only about how to achieve better grades and make her mother happy. She thought her mother would always be loved like this, and their happy life would continue, but to her surprise, Yi Han couldn't shake it off like a nightmare, unable to see them live well. She was deeply mired in the mud, and they couldn't be on the shore. Ye Zhirang hates him. Grandpa Pei said that Yi Han would definitely pay the price he deserved, but the price was still too cheap for him. Evil people like him should have experienced the pain of being stabbed, bleeding too much, being trapped in a fire, suffocating and dying. But what's the use of her hating again? She couldn't do anything and even became a burden to the most innocent Pei Jinghuai. Everything is just because her stepfather Pei Qingji is a good person, Grandpa Pei is a good person, and Pei Jinghuai is a great person. Ye Zhirang looked at the photo of her with her mother and stepfather on the table and couldn't help but shed tears once again. Grandpa Pei is right. If you want to stop being a burden and live your life as you please, you must study hard and work hard to make a way for yourself. And at this moment, it's different from her inspiring her own aspirations. Pei Jinghuai, sitting in the living room downstairs, was holding his arms and looking at the hot envelope placed on the table in front of him, feeling worried. He was thinking about how to tactfully tell Ye Zhirang that her letter had been returned, and her pen pal was also fake. To put it bluntly, children will definitely cry. Pei Jinghuai felt a headache whenever he thought of her pitiful and disappointed expression. When he was feeling worried, Ye Zhirang walked down the stairs with a water cup in his hand. When he saw him, he was stunned for a moment and said, "Uncle, why haven't you slept yet?" Pei Jinghuai, with a slightly panicked movement, pressed the envelope under the stack of documents by the table. "Uncle." Pei Jinghuai said, "What's up?" "No," Ye Zhirang shook his head and hurriedly quickened his pace to leave his sight. Pei Jinghuai breathed a sigh of relief and returned to the bedroom. After taking a shower, he stared at the letter for a long time. If it were according to his usual personality, there was no reason to be conflicted. A child who has nothing to do with oneself, an expectation that has nothing to do with him, whether she is disappointed or not, what does it matter to him? But at the thought of Ye Zhi's endless tears and restrained sobs, he began to feel a headache and a soft heart. What exactly should we do? Entangled repeatedly, Pei Jinghuai did the biggest foolish thing in his life. He opened Ye Zhirang's letter the next evening. While having dinner, Pei Jinghuai pretended to casually hand the letter to Ye Zhirang. The butler entrusted me to give it to you. You can make pen pals, but you can't delay your studies. If you want to reply, just write it and hand it over to me. I'll find someone to help you send it. Ye Zhirang looked at the envelope in his hand, feeling excited and surprised. Thank you, uncle. But I can do the mailing myself, so I won't trouble you, he said. Pei Jinghuai frowned and said, I told you not to trouble me. Can you write your home address randomly? Ye Zhirang lowered his head and said, I'm sorry, uncle. If you don't want me to send the letter, I can. Before she could finish speaking, Pei Jinghuai interrupted her and said, Did I say I wouldn't let you send it? You give me the letter, and I'll find someone to help you send it. Ye Zhirang understood his meaning, but she still hesitated a bit. She was really afraid of bothering others. Pei Jinghuai appeared somewhat impatient due to his nervousness, and his expression became even colder. Eat quickly, there will be tutoring after dinner. Ye Zhirang could only put down the envelope, pick up chopsticks, and continue to pick up the rice from the bowl. Seeing her like this, Pei Jinghuai felt even more restless and uneasy. If he had known she had received the letter and there would have been so much trouble, he shouldn't have done so much. He picked a piece of sweet and sour pork tenderloin for Ye Zhirang with a public chopstick and said, Eat the vegetables. Ye Zhirang nodded in surprise and put the meat wrapped in sauce into his mouth, bulging his cheeks like a frightened little beast. She brightened her eyes and said to Pei Jinghuai with a hint of confusion, Thank you, uncle. Watching her swallow the food in her mouth, Pei Jinghuai's restlessness eased slightly. After dinner, while waiting for the tutor to arrive, Ye Zhirang eagerly opened the letter, which contained a piece of paper and a snow postcard as a gift. She unfolded the letter and read it word by word carefully, feeling that the exclamation mark was somewhat familiar to her. It was like someone who was used to writing with a continuous pen, intentionally correcting their habit and writing with each stroke. At the end of the letter, the exclamation mark says that communication should be a happy thing, just like a long time no see or recent friend greeting, full of longing and freshness. Therefore, the letter should not be transmitted too frequently. It's better to send it twice a year, once it's the birthday she wrote when introducing herself in the letter, and once it's the year.end greeting. Half a year, waiting for good news, together with good luck and happiness. Ye Zhirang read the letter over and over again. Because she was too excited, she immediately took out a piece of paper and prepared to write a reply. However, as soon as she wrote the beginning of a sentence, the tutor knocked on the door and came in. She hastily put away the letter and began to listen attentively to the boring math class. The next morning, Ye Zhirang was about to leave and handed the written reply to Pei Jinghuai, bowing 3, 9, or 10 times to express his gratitude. Pei Jinghuai looked at the letter in his hand, with mixed feelings in his heart, always feeling guilty about deceiving children. But looking at Ye Zhi's happy and expectant smile, he felt that he might not have done anything wrong. He just protected the happiness of a timid child bravely making friends in his own way. Just like there is no Santa Claus in the world, but generation after generation of children still believe that they can receive gifts from Santa Claus. Adults should protect children's innocence. Pei Jinghuai comforted himself and opened the reply letter written by Ye Zhirang, with her happiness reflected between the lines. On Saturday, as usual, I went to visit Mr. Pei. Mr. Pei was lying on the hospital bed, propping himself up and listening to Ye Zhirang chattering about interesting things that had happened in school this week. Pei Jinghuai sat on the chair on the other side of the bed, guarding the trash can and peeling apples. As they chatted, Ye Zhirang suddenly mysteriously said that he had something particularly happy to share with his grandfather. Mr. Pei watched with great interest as she took out the envelope from her backpack. "Grandpa, I received a reply from my pen pal." As soon as she said this, Pei Jinghuai's apple-peeling hand slipped, and the blade cut through his finger, causing blood to gush out. He frowned and hissed, then put down his knife and apple. Mr. Pei quickly handed him 2 tissues and angrily said, "You child, you are so restless that you don't know how to be careful." Pei Jinghuai took a tissue and covered the wound, stood up and said, "Dad, I'll go take care of it." Mr. Pei nodded anxiously. Pei Jinghuai looked at the butler standing aside and said, "Uncle Chen, could you please come and help me?" The butler responded and left the ward with him. The door was gently closed. Pei Jinghuai took a few steps and sat down on the bench against the wall, pressing down hard on the bleeding wound. He glanced at the butler and then lowered his eyes, saying, "Uncle Chen, you are a smart person. I won't explain some things to you." In short, the old man likes to hear that child talk about childish things, so we should provide her with materials to please him. "Are you right?" The butler said clearly, "I understand." After sitting for a while, Pei Jinghuai lifted the paper that was covering the wound and saw a not too deep cut that had stopped bleeding. "You go first. If the old man asks, he'll tell me to go smoke a cigarette." "Understood." The butler turned around and walked back to the ward. Pei Jinghuai carefully folded the blood-stained tissue and threw it into the nearby trash can. Sure enough, if you want to tell a lie, you need to be prepared to tell countless more lies.